Thomas adjusted the straps of his backpack, his gaze scanning the unfamiliar terrain of Epsilon 6, a rocky planet with sweeping valleys that were bathed in the turquoise hue of its twin suns. As a seasoned explorer of uncharted worlds, he found solitude in the silent expanse of the unknown. The crisp air hummed with the possibility of new discoveries as he documented the flora around a crystal-clear stream. Suddenly, a loud whirring sound pierced the calm, followed by a bright streak across the sky. Thomas shielded his eyes, watching as a small craft spiraled out of control and crashed into the forest a few kilometers away. His heart raced. He was likely the only human for millions of miles, yet here was undeniable proof he wasn't alone. Without a second thought, he grabbed his emergency kit and sprinted towards the crash site. The forest quickly became dense, the ground uneven, and Thomas had to rely on his instincts and training to navigate swiftly. As he approached, the smell of burnt metal filled the air, and he could see the wreckage tangled in the thick undergrowth. He approached cautiously, scanning for movement. Inside the shattered craft, an alien figure stirred weakly. Thomas paused momentarily. Contact protocols raced through his mind, but the immediate need to help overrode his hesitation. He called out gently, "Hello, I'm here to help you." "Don't be afraid." The alien, a slender figure with luminescent skin, looked up. Her eyes widened in fear and confusion, her body language guarded and pained. She spoke in a series of melodic tones and clicks, none of which Thomas understood. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," Thomas reassured, slowly edging closer. "I'm human from Earth. Can you understand me?" She murmured something indecipherable, her voice quivering. Seeing her distress, Thomas slowed down, showing his empty hands to signify peace. Gently, he examined her for injuries, noting several wounds that needed immediate attention. "Let's fix you up," Thomas said, opening his med kit. He treated her cuts with antiseptic spray and bandages, all the while speaking in a calm, soothing voice about Earth, humans, and where they were now. "I have a shelter not far from here. You'll be safe there," he explained, gesturing back towards the way he had come. With some effort, he helped her out of the wreckage. She was weak but managed to stand with his support. As they walked slowly back to his shelter, the alien looked up at the sky, then at the surrounding landscape, her expression one of mixed wonder and apprehension. Thomas continued to talk, describing the planet's geography and his mission. "I've been exploring planets like this for years," he said, hoping to forge a connection. "It's not often I find someone else out here. It's mostly just rocks and plants." She listened intently, her head tilting occasionally, a gesture Thomas took as a sign of trying to understand. By the time they reached his shelter, an unspoken bond had begun to form, forged by his act of saving her and her tentative trust in his intentions. Inside, Thomas showed her around the small, compact space filled with supplies and equipment. "You can rest here," he offered, pointing to a cot. "I'll do whatever I can to help you get back to where you belong." The alien sat, still observing every move he made. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows into the shelter, Thomas prepared a simple meal, offering some to her. She hesitated, then accepted it, her earlier caution easing slightly as they shared their first meal in silence, each lost in their thoughts about the vastness of the universe that had brought them so unexpectedly together. Morning light filtered through the small window of Thomas's shelter, casting a soft glow on the interior. Lyra, the alien he had rescued, was still sleeping peacefully on the cot. Thomas moved quietly around the small space, preparing for the day ahead. He glanced over at Lyra, wondering about the vast distance she had traveled and the circumstances that led to her crash. Lyra stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She sat up slowly, her gaze fixing on Thomas with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Good morning," Thomas greeted, offering her a warm smile. "How are you feeling today?" Lyra responded with a gentle nod, her voice still a melodic hum. "Better, thanks to you." Her command of his language was shaky, but understandable. "That's great to hear. I made some breakfast." "It's not much, just some ration packs, but they should help," Thomas said, handing her a small package. Lyra took it, examining the contents with interest before mimicking Thomas's actions and starting to eat. The silence was comfortable, filled only with the sounds of their meal. As they ate, Thomas pulled out a digital device. "I've been trying to figure out where you came from. Any chance you can show me on this map?" He handed the device to Lyra, who studied it intently. "This here," she pointed to a region in space that was not well documented by human explorers. That's quite far from known space. What brought you out here?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious about her journey. Lyra paused, her expression turning solemn. I was exploring like you, but something went wrong with my ship. Thomas nodded understandingly, sensing her discomfort. Well, you're safe here for now. Let's focus on getting you fully recovered. Lyra seemed grateful, her shoulders relaxing slightly. After breakfast, Thomas suggested a small walk outside to help her regain her strength. They ventured out into the cool morning air, the landscape around them quiet and serene. As they walked, Thomas pointed out various plants and geological features, sharing bits of information he had gathered during his time on the planet. Lyra listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed her sharp intellect and deep curiosity. Your world must be very different from this, Thomas ventured, wanting to learn more about her. Yes, it's full of colors and life. Not so quiet, Lyra described, her face lighting up with a memory. Thomas smiled, pleased to see her more animated. I hope I can see it someday. They continued their walk, the distance growing easier for Lyra as her strength returned. By the time they returned to the shelter, Lyra was moving with less difficulty, and there was a new lightness in her demeanor. Back inside, Thomas decided to teach Lyra a bit about human technology. They spent the afternoon tinkering with some of the equipment he had brought with him. Lyra proved to be a quick learner, her hands skillful and precise. Thank you, Thomas, she said as they worked together, repairing a damaged sensor. For sharing all this with me. It's the least I can do, Thomas replied. We're both explorers, after all. We learn by sharing, right? Lyra nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of thankfulness and a newfound determination. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light into the shelter, they paused to admire their handiwork. The day had brought them closer, not just as rescuer and rescued, but as fellow travelers connected by their shared curiosity and stranded circumstance. As they prepared for another night, the boundaries of their world seemed less vast, bridged by mutual respect and the budding bonds of friendship. The morning was brisk and clear, ideal for the day's plan. After the initial days of recovery and adjustment, Thomas and Lyra had established a routine that included both language lessons and cultural exchanges. Today, Thomas decided to take it a step further with a project that would require their cooperation. Lyra, I was thinking we could build a small observatory deck. From here, we could get a better look at the stars, and maybe even your home system, Thomas suggested as they finished their breakfast. Lyra's face lit up with excitement, her earlier reticence fading in the face of engaging work. I would like that, Thomas. It would help me feel closer to home. Together, they gathered materials from around the shelter, scrap metal, tools, and some of the more robust foliage that could serve as a makeshift cover. As they worked, they fell into an easy camaraderie, exchanging small talk and instructions. So, how exactly do people build things on your planet? Thomas asked, genuinely curious as he handed Lyra a wrench. Much like this, but we use resonant fields to stabilize structures. It's faster and requires less physical strength, Lyra explained, demonstrating the motions with her hands. That sounds efficient. Here it's all about manual labor, though. Keeps you grounded, Thomas joked, and they both laughed, enjoying the simplicity of the task and each other's company. As the structure began to take shape, Thomas took a break, wiping his brow. You know, Lyra, I haven't met many people who can pick up human tools and just get to work. You have a knack for this. Lyra smiled, pleased. We value adaptability on my planet. I'm glad it's useful here. Their conversation drifted from casual work talk to more personal stories. Thomas shared anecdotes from his travels to other planets, the creatures he'd seen, and the close calls he'd had. Lyra listened intently, her curiosity piqued. What was the most beautiful place you've ever seen? Lyra asked, looking towards the horizon. Thomas thought for a moment. There's a planet in the Orion cluster, entirely covered in bioluminescent plants. At night, it's like looking out over a sea of stars on the ground. What about you? What's your planet like? It's vibrant, full of life. The skies change color with the weather. Lyra paused, her eyes distant but her voice warm with affection for her home. It's beautiful. As they resumed work, their dialogue deepened into discussions about philosophy and ethics, exploring their differing views on space exploration, the responsibilities towards uninhabited planets, and the notion of home. Lyra was particularly interested in human concepts of freedom and exploration. Freedom is a big thing for us. It's why we explore, isn't it? To find new worlds and maybe new versions of ourselves, Thomas mused, securing a beam. Yes, exploration does feel like an expression of freedom, Lyra agreed, assisting him. To see the unknown, to learn. It's exhilarating. By the end of the day, they had not only built a sturdy deck but also bridged their worlds through shared stories and ideals. They stood back to admire their handiwork, the deck sturdy and welcoming against the backdrop of the setting suns. Look at that, Lyra. Our first joint project, Thomas said with a grin, his voice filled with pride. Lyra joined him, her tone equally content. Yes, our project. Thank you, Thomas, for making me feel at home here. They spent the evening on the new deck, looking up at the stars, each pointing out constellations from their respective skies, the distance between their worlds shrinking with each shared piece of the universe. The morning found Thomas and Lyra embarking on a new routine that extended beyond the confines of the shelter. Their project from the previous day had left them with a sense of accomplishment and a thirst for more collaborative tasks. Today's agenda was exploring the aquatic systems of Epsilon 6, aiming to sample water and observe aquatic life, which Thomas had noted was remarkably underdocumented. As they prepared their equipment, Thomas introduced the idea with enthusiasm. Water ecosystems here are unique. I've noticed some life forms during my surveys, but I haven't had a chance to study them closely. Interested in being a xenobiologist for a day? Lyra's eyes sparkled with interest. I would love that. Back home, I studied xenobiology at the academy. It's fascinating to see life evolve under different conditions. Perfect. There's a lake not too far from here. We can start there, Thomas suggested as they loaded their gear onto a small rover. The ride to the lake was bumpy but scenic, winding through diverse terrains. Lyra's fascination with the planet grew, and she frequently asked Thomas to stop so she could collect samples of plants or soil. At the lake, the water shimmered under the light of the twin suns, reflecting a spectrum of colors neither of them had seen on Earth. They set up their portable lab and began collecting water samples, Lyra meticulously documenting their findings. How different is this from your water bodies? Thomas asked while peering into a microscope. Lyra, busy cataloging a water sample, looked up thoughtfully. It's less viscous, and the mineral content is lower. But these microorganisms, she pointed at the microscope, they're similar to aquatic phytoplankton back home. They spent the morning in scientific exploration, exchanging knowledge about their planet's aquatic life forms. The conversation gradually shifted from professional to personal, as the serene setting lent itself to quieter, more introspective dialogue. Thomas skimmed a stone across the lake, watching it bounce lightly. I always wondered what it would be like to meet someone from another world. And here you are, making a day by the lake feel like a leap into the unknown. Lyra laughed, a sound that Thomas found increasingly delightful. And I never imagined I'd be so welcomed by someone from another species. Your openness it's quite extraordinary. Feeling emboldened by their isolation and the peaceful environment, Thomas sat down on the bank, patting the ground next to him, inviting Lyra to join. She sat beside him, pulling her knees up to her chest, looking out over the water. I often think about why we explore, Thomas said after a moment. Part of it is curiosity, the need to know what's out there. But there's also the hope of understanding ourselves better through the eyes of others. Lyra nodded, turning to face him. Yes, seeing ourselves through others' eyes can be revealing. It's like looking into a mirror and seeing a new reflection every time. The conversation paused as they took in the view. Thomas felt a profound connection, not just to Lyra, but to the universe itself. It was a reminder of how small and interconnected everything was. Lyra, I'm glad you're here. Even under these circumstances, Thomas confessed, his voice tinged with sincerity. Lyra turned to him, her expression softening. I am too. Despite the crash, this feels like where I'm supposed to be. They spent the rest of the day at the lake, collecting samples and recording observations, but the scientific pursuit had turned into something more, a deep, shared experience that neither of them had anticipated. As the suns began to set, casting long shadows over the water, they packed up their gear. The ride back was quiet, each lost in thought, contemplating the unexpected depth of their new friendship. Back at the shelter, they unloaded their equipment, their movements synchronized, a silent acknowledgement of their partnership. That night, they sat on the observatory deck, not just as fellow scientists, but as friends who had glimpsed a future enriched by shared discoveries and mutual understanding. Thomas and Lyra found themselves in the shelter later that week, organizing equipment for yet another day's expedition. But there's a palpable shift in the air. Subtle glances and hesitant touches indicated a burgeoning change in their relationship. Have you ever thought about What happens next? I mean, for us? Thomas asked as he checked the functionality of a scanner. The question hung awkwardly in the air, heavier than the tools they prepped. Lyra paused, her hands still for a moment, and then resumed her task. I have, she admitted quietly. It's complicated, isn't it? Yes, it is. I mean, you'll eventually be rescued, and then... Thomas trailed off, unsure how to continue. He wasn't even certain of what he hoped her answer would be. Lyra set down the device she was holding, her eyes meeting his. Thomas, these past weeks with you have been unexpected. More than I could have imagined when I first crashed here. She stepped closer, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want to ignore what I'm feeling now. Thomas felt a surge of relief and excitement mixed with a tinge of fear. I feel the same, he said, closing the small space between them. I guess I've been afraid to admit it. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension of unspoken words filling the room until Lyra reached out her hand, placing it gently on his arm. What if we just focus on the now? Can we do that? Yeah, I'd like that, Thomas replied, his hand covering hers. Feeling bolder, Thomas guided her to a bench inside the shelter. They sat closely, turning to face each other. Tell me something about you that no one else knows, he suggested, wanting to deepen their connection. Lyra thought for a moment, then smiled. I used to dance. Not just casually, but trained as a dancer for many years. It was my passion before I chose my career. I can't imagine you dancing in zero gravity, Thomas chuckled, trying to picture it. It's easier than you think, she laughed, her mood lightening. What about you? Any hidden talents? I'm an amateur poet, he confessed with a shy grin. Not that it's much use out here, but I like to write about the places I've seen. I'd love to hear some of your poems sometime, Lyra said, her interest genuine. Maybe I will, he replied, pleased by her interest. The conversation flowed more freely after that, their earlier hesitation forgotten as they shared stories and dreams. As the evening wore on, they moved to prepare a simple meal together, their actions synchronized, comfortable. After eating, Thomas hesitated, then turned to Lyra, his expression serious. Lyra, I don't know exactly how to say this, but I haven't felt this way about anyone in a long time. Lyra reached out, touching his face gently. Neither have I, Thomas. It's scary, but it feels right. Encouraged, Thomas leaned in slowly, his heart racing. Lyra met him halfway, and they kissed, a soft, tentative exploration that quickly deepened. The kiss was a silent acknowledgement of their mutual feelings, filled with the promise of what was to come. After a breathless moment, they parted slightly, foreheads resting together. This feels like a new beginning, Thomas whispered. Yes, a beginning, Lyra agreed, her voice a soft echo of his own joy and hope. That night, under the stars of Epsilon 6, they found not just solace in each other's arms, but a shared vision of the present, unmarred by the uncertainties of their future. Their connection, forged in the solitude of a distant world, seemed destined to grow stronger with each passing day. The newfound intimacy between Thomas and Lyra brought with it a gentle ease, and yet a shadow of uncertainty lingered as they prepared for the day's activity. They planned to ascend the nearby ridge that offered a panoramic view of the landscape, a fitting challenge given their recent emotional revelations. As they checked their equipment, Lyra seemed thoughtful, her usual bright demeanor tinged with hesitation. Thomas noticed her distraction and decided to address it directly. Lyra, what's on your mind? You seem a bit off today, he said, handing her a water bottle. Lyra accepted the bottle, taking a deep breath before speaking. I was thinking about what happens when my people come to get me. The distance between our worlds isn't just physical, Thomas. Thomas nodded, understanding her concerns. I know it's a lot to think about. But whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. Let's not let those worries spoil our time now. You're right, Lyra agreed, managing a small smile. Let's keep our focus on today. The hike was challenging but invigorating, with steep climbs and rugged terrain. As they ascended, the physical effort seemed to clear their minds, and the conversation flowed more freely than it had all morning. So, tell me more about your family, Thomas asked as they took a short break, looking out over a vast expanse of green below them. Lyra sat on a large rock, pulling her knees close. I have 2 siblings. We're very close, though our careers have taken us to different corners of the galaxy. What do they do? My sister is a researcher, studying undersea ecosystems on distant planets. My brother designs spacecraft. He would have loved to see this one. She gestured to their surroundings with a laugh. Thomas chuckled. He might yet get a chance. We could visit Earth together, show them what it's like. Lyra's eyes lit up at the thought, but then she sighed. It's a beautiful dream, Thomas. But our lives are so different. How could it work? Thomas reached out, taking her hand. I don't have all the answers, Lyra. But I know that what I'm feeling for you is worth exploring, no matter the obstacles. Lyra squeezed his hand, her expression softening. I feel the same. It's just daunting, the unknown. It is, he agreed. But today, here with you, it feels like everything will turn out right. Their break over, they continued their ascent, reaching the ridge as the sun began to set. The view was breathtaking, a vast panorama that stretched to the horizon. They set up their camera to capture the moment, working together in comfortable silence. As the sky turned to a blaze of oranges and reds, Thomas turned to Lyra, his heart full. Look at that sunset, Lyra. It's like the whole universe is celebrating with us. Lyra laughed, her earlier worries seeming to melt away in the warm glow of the setting sun. It does feel like that, doesn't it? Maybe it's a sign. Let's take it as one, Thomas said, pulling her close. They watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky darkening into a star-filled night. There on that high ridge, they made plans for the future, not knowing what it held but ready to face it together. As they descended back to the shelter under the light of their headlamps, their steps were light, their bonds strengthened by the shared day and the dreams that filled their hearts. The serenity of the previous day's sunset still lingered as Thomas and Lyra organized their shelter early in the morning. The chirping of distant wildlife accompanied their movements, a reminder of the peace they had found on Epsilon 6. But today was different. Today they were expecting the arrival of Lyra's rescue team. Thomas could sense Lyra's nervous anticipation. He knew this day might come, yet now that it was here, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He tried to keep the atmosphere light. So, what's the first thing you're going to show your people about Earth? Thomas asked, handing Lyra a cup of brewed local leaves they had discovered together. Lyra took the cup, her hands clasping it for comfort. Maybe the observatory deck we built. It's not exactly high-tech, but it's ours. Thomas smiled, but his heart was heavy. They'll love it. As they made final adjustments to the area, ensuring it looked presentable for her people, a software in the sky announced the arrival of the rescue ship. It was sleek and silvery, reflecting the sun's rays as it descended smoothly onto the open ground near the shelter. Lyra stiffened, watching the ship land. They are here. Thomas stood by her side, offering a reassuring presence. Together, they watched as the hatch opened and 3 figures stepped out, dressed in uniforms similar to Lyra's but with distinctions in color and design that marked their ranks. The lead figure, who appeared to be in command, approached them. He spoke in Lyra's native tongue, his voice formal. Lyra responded, her voice steady, but Thomas could hear the undercurrent of nervousness. This is Thomas, Lyra introduced, switching to English for his benefit. He saved my life. The commander turned to Thomas, extending a hand. We are in your debt, Thomas of Earth. I am Captain Sellen. We've heard much about your kindness. Just doing what anyone would have done, Thomas replied, shaking his hand. Captain Sellen nodded, then his gaze shifted back to Lyra. We need to debrief you and check your health. Standard procedure. Of course, Lyra said, though she lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting Thomas's. It was a silent message of reassurance. Thomas watched as Lyra walked towards the ship with her people. Captain Sellen stayed behind to speak more with Thomas. She speaks very highly of you, Sellen said once the others were out of earshot. It's rare to see such bonds formed in these circumstances. Thomas shrugged, trying to mask his anxiety. We've had a unique few weeks. I can imagine. Lyra mentioned you're quite the explorer yourself. There's much we don't know about this region. Your insights will be invaluable, Sellen suggested, looking around at the setup Thomas and Lyra had built together. I'd be happy to share what I've learned, Thomas said, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the way to maintain a connection with Lyra's world. As they talked, Thomas shared details about the planet's geography, the flora and fauna he'd cataloged, and the survival techniques he'd developed. Captain Sellen listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions that showed his interest wasn't just polite. It was strategic. Your knowledge could help us greatly, Sellen concluded. Perhaps there could be an exchange of information between our worlds. I'd like that, Thomas replied, his heart lifting slightly with the possibility of future collaboration. When Lyra returned, her expression was composed, but she managed a small smile for Thomas. Everything's okay. They're going to prepare for our departure soon. Thomas nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. I'm glad you're okay. Lyra took his hand, squeezing it gently. Let's enjoy the rest of our time together, shall we? As the day faded into evening, Thomas and Lyra spent the remaining hours walking the terrain, revisiting the spots that had marked their journey. They spoke little, each lost in their thoughts but comforted by the presence of the other. The night sky was clear, the stars bright, as they returned to the shelter for the last time, ready to face whatever the morning would bring. The dawn was quiet, a serene start to what would be a poignant day. Thomas and Lyra had packed their belongings, each item a reminder of the time they had spent together. They stood outside the shelter, waiting for the rescue team to signal it was time to leave. I wish we had more time, Thomas said, his voice low, as he helped Lyra adjust the pack on her shoulders. Lyra nodded, her expression somber. So do I. But I'll carry this place, and you with me no matter where I go. Just then, Captain Selen approached them. We're ready to depart. Lyra, everything is set for your return. Thomas and Lyra exchanged a long look. Thank you, Captain, Lyra said. Then, turning to Thomas, she added, Let's walk to the ship together. As they walked towards the landing site, Captain Selen fell into step beside Thomas. Thomas, I've spoken with my superiors. We'd like to extend an invitation to you. We're interested in establishing a more formal exchange with Earth. Your experience and knowledge would be invaluable to us. Thomas was taken aback. Really? I would be honored. I have a lot to consider, but I'm very interested. Lyra squeezed his hand, smiling. I hoped they would say that. They reached the ship, its hull gleaming under the rising sun. The crew was busy preparing for takeoff, but everything paused as Thomas and Lyra stood before the entry ramp. Before I go, Lyra began, turning to face Thomas fully. There's something I need to say. She took a deep breath. Abandoned alien saved by human marries her rescuer, she said, the words a whisper between them. Thomas looked at her, confusion evident on his face. What do you mean? Lyra's smile broadened. It's an old saying from my world. When someone saves another, an unbreakable bond forms. I've spoken with Captain Selen, and with your consent, we'd like to honor that bond. Captain Selen nodded. It's true. We respect the customs of those who aid us. If you both agree, we would hold a ceremony to honor this bond, right now, before we depart. Thomas felt a rush of emotions. Yes, I would like that very much. The crew quickly set up a simple yet dignified ceremony at the base of the ship. Thomas and Lyra stood together, hand in hand, as Captain Selen officiated. In the presence of the cosmos, we witness and honor the bond between Lyra of Homeworld and Thomas of Earth. May their paths be forever united in the spirit of knowledge and exploration. The crew applauded, and several of Lyra's teammates stepped forward to congratulate them. Thomas felt overwhelmed but deeply joyful. He turned to Lyra, his wife, and kissed her, the weight of the universe seeming to lift in that moment. As the ceremony concluded, Captain Selen spoke again. We must depart now, but this is not a goodbye. We await your decision, Thomas. Lyra embraced Thomas tightly. I'll see you soon, either on my world or yours. With one last kiss, Lyra boarded the ship. Thomas stepped back, watching as the ship lifted off, feeling a profound connection to the stars above. He returned to the shelter, his heart full of hope for the future. He knew he would follow her, that his next great adventure was just beginning, and that the universe was indeed vast and filled with wonders waiting to be explored, wonders that now included a love that spanned galaxies.